Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining our Ask Me Anything session today on finding and building remote teams that work. I'm Erin Warner. I'm the membership specialist at Communitech. And before we get started, I just have a few reminders for today's event. So this session is being recorded so that it can be shared as a resource for our founders to reference later. You can find all of our past AMA recordings at communitech.ca. We welcome questions throughout today's discussion. Please use the Q&A feature to ask your questions, or you can upvote questions that have already been submitted. Please don't feel like you have to hold your questions until the end of the presentation. If you're interested in following up after the session to discuss this topic further, please connect with your Communitech Founder Success Manager, or you can connect directly with Richelle on LinkedIn. And we have some upcoming AMAs as well. So we have 2 in January. The Eventbrite links will be coming out shortly. So please check out your Week in Tech and the Startup and Scale Up newsletters for the upcoming sessions. And with that, I will turn it over to Richelle Matthews, COO of Global Talent Accelerator, to further introduce herself.
On and the mic. Thanks, Erin, so much for the introduction, and welcome everyone. So as Erin mentioned, I'm Richelle Matthews. I'm the COO of Global Talent Accelerator, and so I'll talk a little bit more about what we do scattered throughout the presentation, as well as our roots and history. But just in a quick nutshell, we leverage data to find outsourcing companies for scaling tech companies. So we really are we're a support to companies that need to grow and scale quickly. And I'll chat a little bit more about that. But to give you some background on myself, my history, work history, I spent 12 years working in sub-Saharan Africa and Bangladesh, so very global, in a cross section of technology and agriculture, which is a little bit unique. I started working in Kenya at the time when mobile money was just being launched, which is basically the ability to transfer money phone to phone without the use of a bank account. So it was a pretty neat tech moment for many developing nations. And then relocated back to Canada, and I ran an accelerator for TELUS looking at technologies that they wanted to use, integrate, or commercialize, as well as an accelerator for RBC on social enterprise ventures. And then I had an experience of my own social enterprise venture. I had the opportunity to participate in the HALT Prize, where we had 8 weeks to build and sort of test a tech startup, and then pitch to former President Bill Clinton for $1 million at the United Nations. So he is as charming as everybody says, but unfortunately we came in second, and second is no money, just a handshake from Bill. So I'm not sure if that's a prize or not. And then I also did, which I'll weave in through my presentation today, I have a master's degree in the neuroscience of acculturation. So basically what's going on in the brain when people are working across cultures, and we'll chat a little bit more about neuroscience throughout my presentation. So now that I've introduced myself, it feels slightly like I'm talking to my own computer screen and myself, because I cannot see your faces. So if people just want to hit me up in the chat and do a quick introduction, name and name of their company, and then number of team members on your company would be really helpful, just so I can sort of scale what I'm talking to based on size of company. So I will please go. So if you just pop that into the general chat, I'll watch for those to come up, just so I can have a little bit of context. Hi, Thomas. Wow, 46, great. Hi, Patrick. Okay, 4, awesome, great. Let's give people a couple more seconds. So if you were responding to a Slack or an email, if you have a second and want to put in the chat the number of company, or your name, the name of the company you're with, and the number of people on your team, that would be great. I'll just give you ID. Okay, great. 2 from Empowered. Sound like you guys are growing. So just please feel free to keep adding those in. Hi Craig. I'm gonna keep watching the chat as I go and dive into the presentation, and then hi Paulo. And then that way I can make sure that my content is focused on your needs. So I'm going to share my screen and jump into the presentation. Hi Juliana. And we'll get going. So okay. Sorry, you guys get to see what happened there. I have this all tested and set up. So now you have a quick second to look at my wedding photo. So like I said, I'm with Global Talent Accelerator, and today the topic is finding and building tech teams that work. So I'm gonna try and cover it from A to Z, and feel free to ask questions. If you want to throw them in the chat, then I will get to them at the very end, just in case I'm answering anything along the way. I did receive some questions in advance, so I've tried to incorporate those questions into the presentation. So how many people, if you just want to give me a thumbs up, how many people are experiencing this problem? You need more engineers. It is, I think I get a phone call, at least one phone call a day from companies that are having this problem. And so I don't know if are Star Trek fans, but it's kind of that she can't take it anymore. So the idea that it's a constant problem for people, and they're having to find creative ways to address that. So just to give you some statistics, there are, so ICTC, I don't know if people follow ICTC, but if not, it's right at the bottom there. They're a not-for-profit that does a lot of research into what's going on in the tech space. So they're predicting 250,000 jobs in the tech space that will be unfilled by 2025. So that's pretty huge. And if you think about that in relation to your company, we don't have official stats on this, but I would say for lots of companies, one tech job post often represents 3 unfilled positions. That's not an official stat, but that's sort of anecdotal. And Canada, to be quite honest, we're not keeping up. So we produce 14,760 graduates, post-secondary graduates in all relevant categories: math, computer science, computer engineering, per year. That doesn't include all the coding schools. So if you look at coding schools, that's a higher level, but in terms of university graduates. And but from April 2021, job postings were up over 30% pre-pandemic. So I won't drill on this. I won't focus on this too long. I'm sure that most people are experiencing this problem on a day-to-day basis. Just so you have some stats to know that the problem is very real. So there's 3 big factors that are changing the hiring environment. And so the first is brain drain. They're calling it brain drain 2.0. Has anybody heard of that term before? So what is US companies are coming to Canada, and they are hiring Canadian technical talent at US salaries and allowing people to work remote. And so because of that, so a lot of senior talent is actually engaged in contracts in the US, and depending on the space that you're in, people are often engaged on contract versus being full-time employees. So they're getting a very high rate, and it makes it very hard for Canadian companies to compete. This is probably another problem that I talk to most of our clients about on a basis. And so it's really important for companies to understand that you're now in a global hiring market. You're no longer in a Ontario hiring market, a Canadian hiring market. It's become global. And the reason it's become global is that, as you know, anybody can work for most companies from anywhere in the world, or even anywhere nationally, or often cross-border into the US. So that presents a lot for tech talent. Remote work. So BDC did a study, and they said that 70% of companies don't plan to bring their employees back full time into the office. So the very nature of work has shifted through COVID. And then obviously salary increases. I'm sure many of you are experiencing that. We have a very large telco client that we're working with, and the salary ranges that they had versus what the market was demanding was anywhere from $20,000 to $30,000 too low. And basically, that's kind of more traditional in industry trying to compete with tech companies. But you can assume that the average salary has gone at minimum 5 to 10% up for tech workers, if not more like 30 or 40%, depending if you're competing with US companies. So the market is going crazy. And that also, you'll also probably, some of you are experiencing that talent is coming and asking for very, very high salaries, positioning themselves as senior when they maybe have 5 years of experience. So just the whole market has become quite skewed because Amazon's hiring so many people, US companies are moving into Canada, and you're competing on a global market. So if you're facing some of these challenges, they're pretty real, and they're happening to most companies across the country. So the first, so I want to dive into finding talent. And so I'm curious, what is your talent strategy? So do you only focus on permanent hires? Do you focus on contractors, either local or global? Do you use on-demand teams or outsourcing, or are you fairly ad hoc? So if you just want to throw a letter into the chat, that would be helpful, and I'll know where to drill in. Okay. Thanks, Thomas. Okay. Thanks, Patrick. A am more than B. Okay. And if anyone else wants to throw a letter in there. So we're gonna talk, that gives me some A and B. Okay, thanks, Craig. I want to just before I dive into talent strategy, I just want to reframe the problem a little bit. So often we get really focused on hiring, especially it's a little bit challenging because so many companies want full-time permanent hires, and there really is a lot of value to that in terms of creating a culture and sort of keeping the intellectual property or organizational memory or development memory in-house. There's a lot of benefits to that. But I want to suggest that people reframe the problem and think about, we need more capacity because capacity builds enterprise value. And so I definitely notice we deal with multiple types of companies, and some companies really understand this, that capacity, so basically technical capacity or team capacity is what's going to build that enterprise value. And so some companies really understand this, and they act fast, and they have a less straightforward talent strategy. They pull from lots of areas. And I just want to talk about that a little bit more. So if you are trying to hire a full team, a full development team, it can take you up to, so let's say a team of 6 people, it can take you, some companies, up to a year, 6 to 9 months to a year. And the reason is, to find that senior lead, you will need about 3 months, and that's being kind of, that's sort of being generous. And then you need to hire intermediates and then QA and fill out the rest of your pod. So the hiring timelines can be quite long if you're only looking at full-time permanent hires. And so the suggestion is, and I can see that some of you are doing it, is to start fishing where the fish are. And so what that means is starting to think about your hiring strategy based on the capacity that you need to deliver on deployment deadlines. And so each group, permanent hires, contractors, or on-demand, have presented a different value proposition based on the stage of your company and what deadlines you're trying to hit. So I'll talk a little bit more about flexibility, but like I said, the value of permanent hires, which many of you know, is that it keeps the knowledge in house, and there is opportunity to build on the cultural internal cultural aspect. Contractors have value as well, and that's generally to strategically bring them in on a specific project. And then on demand teams also have value again at a different stage. Perhaps if you're trying to complete an MVP and you need to get something done quickly, or we often see on demand teams brought on if you are making a transition in your software from a legacy system to updating your tech stack. So, let's say you're on Drupal with PHP and then you want to move to more sort of a modern JavaScript tech stack. That's where we see some of where we often see on-demand teams. But regardless of what your needs are, it's really important to start thinking about what your opportunity cost is. So the tech talent market is moving quickly, and the tech space is moving quickly just because of everything that's happened with COVID and companies needing to digitize and remote work and all those different factors. So it really looks like opportunity cost. So and I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the case studies of some of our clients, but I'll keep that light because truly it's not meant to be a pitch for our business, but it is meant to be something for you to consider. Is that if you are able to bring on a team to deploy on a certain project, you could have them brought on and onboarded within 30 days, so less than 3 months. If you need to hire a team, you're looking at 6-9 months, and then you need to onboard them, and it increases your timeline and it takes longer for them to become productive. We worked with a company called Finaptech, and they used a multi-pronged talent strategy. And so that allowed them to scale and deliver on their MVP on time, and also within the budget that they wanted. So I want to talk a little bit about, for some of you, having a multi-pronged strategy might look a little bit more like hiring global contractors. Some of you are using the contract method of hiring. So I just want to make sure that let me share this. I'm going to turn off my video. And turn off my camera. So for some of you, it might be, your strategy might be a little bit more focused on hiring global contractors. And so some of the questions that we often get is about security, trade sanctions, access to technology, and different talent pockets. And I'm just going to fly through some of these things so I make it through the presentation. So it is really important to consider if you are using outsourcing or global contractors, which is something that's pretty available to you, I think, via Outpost in terms of actually facilitating that. You do need to look into any trade sanctions. So often companies that are have some kind of banking product cannot have contractors out of Russia. I also, just off the top of my head, one of the companies that we're dealing with wanted Latin America region, but there was only select countries in Latin America where they could pull talent from just because of trade sanctions and security. And then also know that certain world regions have access to different pockets of talent technology. So for example, if any of you guys are using Ruby on Rails, that's actually a technology that is quite specific, that has a lot, and I say that loosely, but from a global perspective, more in Canada. And then there's other regions of the world that also has sort of pockets of talent with that tech stack. So when you're looking at technology and finding contractors, both look regionally and then globally. There's certain different regions. And then I'm sure most of you know, so I'm going to fly through this. There's lots of different technical assessments that you can do. I do recommend, especially if you're hiring global contractors, that you do technical assessments so that you can really ensure that the person is who they say they are. And many of these types of platforms have anti-fraud technology built into them and facial recognition. So as they're doing the coding test, it matches it against their social media profiles to ensure that the person is who they say they are. And I can dive a little bit more into security during questions. And then, of course, if you do want to hire remote contractors, there's platforms such as Outpost from Communitech that allows you to hire people in different countries and then ensure that you're in compliance with their local laws from a contracting perspective, which is important. So lots of the questions that I received before the event were around working productively. So how do you actually manage a remote team? And so I'm blanking on the name of the book, but it's I think it's No Rules Rules, and this quote comes from that: "Lead with context, not control." And so that comes from Reed Hastings, the CEO of Netflix. And so we also have a remote team in our company. And this is something that we really try to focus on, leading with context and not control. And the reason is that it's very hard to control people there, when they show up to work, what they're working on when you're working remotely. And so the shift in thinking from a team perspective really needs to be focused on outputs, and how do you manage for outputs, and how do you give people the context so that they can make decisions versus putting control mechanisms in place, which might make people feel slightly micromanaged. The other sort of high level idea to consider is alignment. This takes a lot of effort, but even in my role as CEO of our company, it's something that I really focus on with our entire leadership team, is making sure that we're getting aligned, our leadership team consists. And so we get aligned before we share information with the rest of the team. And the reason for that is that because people are distributed, if you're not aligned in rolling out something for your organization, it can create a lot of confusion, and you don't have that feedback loop of, the kitchen or the water cooler, in order to understand if people are understanding what that rollout is or what the changes in organizational. So, from a very sort of management level, one of the things that I suggest doing is creating a swim lane process diagram. And the first time this was recommended to me, it seemed a little bit overwhelming. It's not, my background wasn't process management, so. But this is just an example. I just pulled it off the internet, but you can see here that it defines what roles people are playing, and then the process. And for for our organization, it actually increased our efficiency, I would say, by 25 to 50%. And the reason is that we mapped it out in a way that everybody that is in our organization could understand and see the process from A to Z, from a client coming to us saying, "Hey, we need a team," all the way through to the fulfillment and the customer success of that team. And in our team retreats, what we do is we use this as our source of truth, and we as we make adjustments, we adjust the diagram, but and everybody can see what our process is, so that we're all aligned. This isn't our actual process, but I just wanted people to have an example. And then, so I'm going to fly through some of this because we're already at 10:02. So the other thing is communication. And so if you have a diverse team, or maybe they're global, or even if you have a diverse team coming from different regions, city versus country, we use this a lot. I speak English, you speak English, we aren't speaking the same language. And it's really important that, as part of working productively, you get everybody on the same page and ensure that your organization is speaking the same language, and you're running with operating principles that everybody can guide their behavior by. So I was going to dive a little bit more into this, but I just want to talk a little bit about the brain, especially if you are operating across multiple regions. That culture is something that actually it comes from the formation of neural pathways very early on. So let's say you are have people on your team that maybe come from an East Asian culture where there's less openness to people asking direct questions to their boss. They're processing information in their brain more relationally as part of their neurodevelopment, meaning that context and central object are equal. So that's what it means to be um, a little bit more of a relational thinker versus if you grew up in an individualistic culture, then you look at the central object and then have rules in relation to the object, which is a little bit more of a North American way of thinking. Obviously, that's a broad generalization that's fairly quick. So this section kind of goes a little bit more into what some people's pre-questions were, and I'll fly through it in a couple minutes. Trust is earned when actions meet words. So it's really your do or your positioning, your actions follow through. So that's part of kind of, if you are asking for direct feedback, then it's important that after you give that feedback, you give cues to people saying that that feedback was accepted and valued. In terms of building meaningful relationships, one of the things that we do is quarterly in-person meetings. If you're nervous about COVID, we actually did our last one outside, and we did it for 2 days, and it was very productive and also bonding for people because they had the chance to kick around a soccer ball, and we did an outdoor yoga class, and we worked on our processes, and it allows people that sense of play, and it also shifts their brain, because when you're looking at a screen all day, your focus becomes very narrow. As soon as you get outside, then your focus, think, a little bit more creativity. Another thing I'll just highlight really quickly is that we do walkie-talkies. So this is another tool that will help build trust, is that each person is paired with somebody else in the organization, and they go for a 30-minute walk outside once a week with a different person each week. And the goal is to build relationships, not talk about work, but to get to know the person. And that also just builds more cohesiveness in the organization. So just at a very high level, so we can get to questions. Action number 1 is to consider, what is your hiring strategy? So what type of talent do you need? When? What are your timelines? What's your plan A for talent? What's your plan B? What hires are critical to deployment? And how should I adjust my talent strategy as I scale? If you're very small and you're a 4 or 5 person company, then it might make sense to do only full-time permanent hires till you get and you're able to sort of expand to contractors or remote teams. Organizational practices is number 2. So how do you lead for context versus control? What are your operating principles so that everybody can focus their behavior or can moderate their behavior around those operating principles and be aligned? Outputs versus time, how do you manage for that? Have you defined your process? And then how is knowledge being captured within your organization and transferred from team to team? And then the last is your unique competing zone. So just being productive. So focus on the mission of your organization. I'd recommend more of a sports team analogy than a family, because as people are united around that purpose, once they're no longer united, it's easier for them to self-select out. And then how do you build meaningful team connections? And then what's your composition of your team in terms of culture, age group, and gender? And how do you capture those perspectives so that you're building a more robust product? And so then just lastly, thinking about your capacity to deliver based on your business cycle. So I know that and once again, I just kind of want to bring back to the point around how is technical capacity impacting your enterprise value. that is all sort of a lot of food for thought and information to consider. So I'm going to turn it over to questions. We just have 6 minutes left. So I'll just open the floor to questions. And once again, sorry about the technical glitch.
Thanks, Richelle. You really flew through that.
Yeah, sorry. I just feel like I'm like, blah.
Anyone who has questions, you can feel free to post them in the Q&A section or in the chat. I'll keep an eye out for them there. But Richelle, I was wondering if you could expand more on practical ways that teams could start to break down the barriers of speaking the same language and moving past more superficial conversations and getting more down into the depths of how people work and best ways to communicate with your team members.
Yeah, so one of, I'll talk about 2 examples with our company. The first thing that we do is we do a quarterly in-person retreat. And like I said, that's either indoor or outdoor. And we mix business and we mix play. And so play is actually very important. And so if you're not a playful or sports person, find someone on your team that can really lead that. And the reason is that you want people to build positive connections with each other, and play allows them to do that. So if you're not able to meet in person, doing a quiz night, a pub night, something like that. So the first thing is to actually build relationships. In our culture, we often focus on work and then relationships. In a remote culture, you got to think about relationships first. And then the other thing that I touched on briefly is it's the reason we initiated a walkie-talkie where you're paired with somebody for 30 minutes and you go for a walk with them outside on the phone. And one, it opens up, and you're not supposed to discuss work. And the reason that we do that is then people actually get to know, people actually get to know the other person. And you are right, Craig, it is hard to do that with global contractors due to time zone differences. But then I would still think of a creative way where people can connect. And this actually is specifically, Craig, I don't know if you feel comfortable elaborating where your global contractors are, because in lots of cultures, you will increase productivity if you focus on building the relationship. So, Eastern Europe might be a little bit more direct. So if it's so then maybe you just want to do like a Skype call or have a team gathering, kind of a breakfast slash dinner where there's kind of some purpose and small talk, or a pub night, just to get to know. And by pub night, I mean, a quiz night, where people can still have that informal interaction. If you are in a culture like, South Africa or a Latin American culture, relationship first is really important. And so getting to know people and their families and all that sort of stuff will actually really increase their productivity level, because they're more communal, generally more communal in how they operate. Any other questions?
And so when teams are looking to hire remotely, whether that's just outside of their region, so going outside of Waterloo region to maybe across Canada or even across the world, what are some extra things that people need to keep in mind compared to hiring within their region?
Sure. So I think that it's different if you're hiring within Canada or if you're hiring outside of Canada. So if you're hiring outside of Canada, the first thing that's really important is trade sanctions or security. So if you're hiring out of Eastern Europe, you do need to check, especially for banking products, where you can and can't hire from. Trade sanctions in some markets, I believe, if I remember correctly, it's Iran, where certain technologies are not available just because of trade restrictions. And then technical vetting, which people will be more willing to do internationally. And then if you're hiring within, let's say, the Canadian region, it's, just thinking about, are they going to be using your device or their device, or how do they access your environment? And then what networks are you using to access the local talent market so that you can actually find the people that you're looking for. Is there any other questions that I can answer?
I don't see anyone, any other questions, and we are out of time. So sorry for everyone that if you weren't able to get to your questions that you had submitted previously. But I wanted to thank Richelle for joining us and everyone else on the platform today. We will be sending out an email afterwards, so you can feel free to connect with Richelle on LinkedIn, or you can connect with your Communitech FSM as well, and we can connect you to Richelle that way, and you can get to pick her brain a little bit more. But that is all that we have time for today.
And
yeah, Richelle just
I just threw it in the, so feel free to reach out to me directly, and apologies again for the technical glitch. I don't know what happened. But it made
the best.
The presentation more exciting. So thanks so much for everybody, and please feel free to reach out directly. And thanks, Erin, for having me.
Yeah, it was a pleasure to have you. Thanks, everyone.